You're now recording.
All right, welcome back, everyone. We're continuing with our subdivisions planning and zoning presentation. So if we don't finish off today, we'll have a bit of a carryover for Thursday. And if we finish up, then Thursday would be a no webinar day, but gives everybody a chance to look at some of the pre-recorded webinars that Claude and I, or especially Claude's been working on. But before we continue, I just want to give an update. So we have just released, and hopefully many of you received the email or are about to receive an email, that we have developed a guide to implementing the authority having jurisdiction in indigenous communities for buildings. And again, the purpose of the guide is to provide council and the housing departments or people responsible for residential building on what is authority having jurisdiction, what does it mean off reserve, what have been the legal implications off reserve, so that's the municipalities across the country, and what's the impact of those court decisions specifically on First Nations. So we have a discussion there, and we talk about the authority having jurisdiction, what it means in First Nations communities. So we've given webinars on this, but now we have a document to sort of show, what have been, where we need to go for authority having jurisdiction, how councils need to have that responsibility moving forward. And we talk about the legal implications for not exercising authority having jurisdiction. And most importantly, we also focus on the importance of a building permit system or a building permission system, and how that really is the essence of how one to exercise the authority having jurisdiction. So it's a detailed, about 65 pages, and you can skim through it. It goes to the back on the steps of how to move forward with that. So I wanted to mention that now because we finally released our document, and it will be a live document. We'll probably be making changes as time goes through. Claude, did you want to recap where we are before we move forward?
Yeah, basically in the very first session, we pretty much have been talking about the issue of subdivision and a little bit about zoning. And really the focus on the first session was really more or less about off-reserve, we'll call it conditions. A little later on, we're going to start, in fact, very shortly, we'll be talking a little more about what about on reserve or in your various First Nation communities. So I think hopefully what we can look at, we'll call it sort of the upper level view, is there is a good comparison, and certainly I think there can be much gained when we start looking at what happens between the two different conditions, both on and off reserve. So I think some of the First Nation communities certainly have been taking a lead on this, and certainly have I won't say bought into the system, but certainly saw the benefits of going with such a system. Probably, to be fair, some of the larger communities where you can afford to do some of these things. So I think what we're trying to do in our subdivision and zoning webinars is really just bring an awareness for everyone, or whoever certainly wants to get the information and really think about it and consider the value of what we're presenting. So yeah, thanks, John.
Okay.
I think really when we start this slide, this is kind of where we left off at the end of our last webinar. We started looking at subdivision control, and again, we're almost finished we'll call it the off-reserve conditions. The bottom two illustrations, we can see one is about housing density, the one to the left, which really sort of portrays dwelling units per acre. Okay, and the one to the extreme left is really, we can see kind of individual single family dwellings. And again, some of the recommendations is about 4 to 10 dwelling units per acre. And again, these are just sort of guidelines. Well, what about townhouses? Now, I don't anticipate there's a lot of townhouses per se on many First Nation communities. There may be perhaps a few. Some of the ones that have the opportunity to consider that as an alternative type of housing. And again, recommendations from a planner's point of view is 20 to 40, we'll call it dwelling units per acre. And then when we start talking about apartments, we start looking at 50 to 100 dwelling units per acre. So we can see there's sort of a progression in from the single family into the middle to a more of a townhouse type units versus apartments. The one to the far right is really up what we call the building envelope. Well, a building envelope, when we talk about building science, is something totally different. But when we talk about building envelope, when we're in reference to zoning, it really is talking about the house. We can see sort of in the hidden sort of dashed lines, sort of a rectangular box. And if we look at the yellow areas, we can see there's arrows indicating sort of a front yard setback, some property line setbacks on the side, and even a rear yard setback. And again, these are sort of the common guidelines that are typically the measures of what we call setbacks. Now, the setbacks can vary depending again whether it's single family, townhouse, or apartments. In some of the old cities and towns, we can look at some of the old stores were built basically right up to the sidewalk. So in other words, almost zero setback. And of course, part of the problems with the, we'll call it sort of that old sort of zoning, or maybe even before zoning, was the fact there's a potential for higher potential for fire and fire to spread to adjacent buildings and neighborhoods and so on. So this is sort of part and parcel of what we often talk about is some of the zoning control regulations or guidelines that are put out there. The other one that I kind of sort of glanced over is if we take a look, we'll see kind of a vertical dimension that talks about maximum building heights. So again, even the heights of a building can be controlled under some, well, actually all zoning regulations to some degree. So in other words, how high can we build a single family house? Going to be 3 stories? Can it be 4 or 5 stories? Seems like if we're starting to do that, we're getting either into a sort of townhouses or apartments or almost into maybe developing, we'll call it a condominium complex. So if you just want to click there, John, all of the Canadian provinces have enacted subdivision control. And it's legislation in one form or another, and subdivision of a tract of land really transfers ownership. So it goes from let's say the original landowner to probably a developer, and then eventually developers are looking at contractors to, of course, build houses or townhouses or apartments and so on. So it really regulates the creation of lots. So the division of land into smaller parcels. Again, it was referring to the single family 4 to 10 dwelling units per acre. So we can see if someone has a large rural property of, let's say, 100 acres, and we start looking at 100 acres times the multiplication of 4 or even 10 units per acre, we can have a pretty good size subdivision on 100 acres of property. Again, guidelines. Well, the other critical part of zoning is also it is related to, in most cases, again, off reserve to the issuing of building permits. What can be built on the property? Permits are required to build any building and structure off reserve. In fact, if I really think back about most building codes, anything over basically 100 square feet requires a building permit. And again, just to reiterate, specifies expectations such as lot size, lot coverage, separation distance, heights, and so on. And it can also identify some areas for special negotiated conditions. Okay, so
just sorry, go ahead.
no, I was going to say you can go to the next slide, but go ahead, John.
I know townhouses is now an interesting development in many communities. I was in a few communities the last few years, And there's a move now to move towards townhouses. And what I found interesting is that these townhouses, because it gets in the issues of CP and access of land and surveying. But what I found interesting in the communities that I was visiting and the construction of townhouses was that well, several factors. One, the economics. They found it much cheaper to build a series of townhouses than a single detached. Two, they're able to address the housing need by building townhouses. Three, they're actually more centralized towards the band office and towards the center of the community. At least the two communities I visited that had townhouses, and they were building them in not straight rows, but on a little bit of an angle. They had some design to it, and one was for south exposure for the sun, and some had like a playground behind, so there's a bit of a shelter in the for against the wind. So they were actually, I think, fairly well developed, and most importantly, it was the general maintenance as well. So it'll be interesting on the chat which communities are developing townhouses. I think I've only seen one apartment dwelling being built, and it was a two-story. But I don't know of many First Nations on reserve that are building any apartments. So I'd be interested to see what's happening on the chat on that one. All right, next slide. Subdivision development layout. Go ahead, Claude.
Yeah, okay. Maybe before I talk about that, maybe another point to consider. I find in townhouses in general, because you share a multitude of, we'll call it common walls in between the units, you're actually looking at energy saving. So when we start thinking about energy saving, when we look at a single individual dwelling unit, we have a lot of different exposure. So again, there's a little bit of, we'll call it energy savings when we have these common walls that separate in between units. Not so much on the end units per se. But moving on, okay, subdivision development layout. In this slide, we can see several options regarding the subdivision development plan. And again, these are pretty much traditional style and what's called flexible zoning models. The purpose of the flexible model is to overcome the sense of rigidity of the conventional land developed type development. If you take a look at a lot of the cities and towns across the country, they're pretty much fairly rectilinear. That is kind of horizontal, vertical, and divided into what we would probably call streets. Nothing wrong with that. But again, some of the more, we'll call it newer subdivisions tend to be a little more, as I say, flexible in zoning per se. So one significant difference is the common open spaces. And again, we take a look at the top one, we don't see a lot of, we'll call it open space per se. We see a lot of development, a lot of properties, and certainly from the, we'll call it the developer and also from the contractor's point of view, the builder's point of view, many houses can be built on that same parcel of land. But what we really see that's really different is in the cluster type development. In the lower slide, we see a lot more open space. So it's sort of a little niches of, we'll call it community based within the subdivision. So it's not so much feeling like you're, I guess, crowded by your neighbor next door. So flexibility and versus the conventional versus the cluster development style. So these open spaces help in preservation of community, common community spaces, and help create sort of buffer zone between the housing groups. The actual layouts for a subdivision can take many different shapes, but these are just to give you a couple of general types of common layouts that I've encountered in the planning side of we'll call building. Okay, next slide there, John. Again, apologize, we're trying to get all the points out there. But subdivisions may also include what is called restrictive covenants. That is, certain restrictions on the property. These might include a number of things, so I'm going to talk about a few of them. restrictions on the certain appropriate exterior finish materials. So for example, my son has some property, he wants to build a house, and they will not accept any type of siding, wood, vinyl, or even, let's say, metal type siding. In fact, that is sort of an example of one of these restrictive covenants. So it really is, we'll call it sort of minimizing the fact that your freedom of choice of materials. In his case, it would be either brick or stone or something a little more solid than just a siding type material. It also can restrict the specific minimum housing size. Again, in his case, it must be at least 2,000 square feet, which does not include the garage. Specific restrictions on work vehicles, for example, trailers, etc., for specific duration parked on the property. So again, his fiance has a food trailer. That trailer would not be allowed in the subdivision to sit, let's say, depending on circumstances, perhaps overnight, or for maybe more than a set duration of time. Or limitations on the property standards, such as simply no derelict vehicles, or certainly maintenance of the property maintenance standards, general upkeep, in order to keep the community, we'll call it, in sort of top-notch shape. So again, many of these are well intended to protect aesthetic qualities in the land and also the community. So again, a different sort of twist on a subdivision control.
In Canada, just outside of Ottawa, all the garages had to be painted like a brown, and there were no clotheslines allowed, not even the ones you can hang up. And so they changed that just recently to allow clotheslines. And even then, you can't have a line, has to be one of the, I don't know what to call the single stands, and they had to specify what type. So I found those restrictions quite interesting, and they're changing now to accommodate for energy cost, right?
Yeah, good points. Okay, next slide. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about consent and severances. And again, some of these terms might be not so familiar to some of you, but certainly we're trying to bring you the awareness again of, we'll call it the conditions and situations sort of off reserve, or in a lot of not so much First Nation communities. So when we start looking at consent and severances for rural, primarily agricultural areas, is a special form of the land subdivision. So it allows a farmer to create a home site on a given land for themselves or other relatives involved in the farming activities. So for example, the sons and daughters could build a house separately from we'll call it the father or the parent. Authorize separation of a piece of land to form a new piece of land from the original land tract. So a consent is required if you want to sell, mortgage, charge, or enter into any agreement for more than 21 years for a portion of your land. So sort of like we'll call it sort of a long-term type agreement. And approval is required, typically has certain conditions attached to it. So a land severance is the authorized separation of a piece of land to form a new lot or parcel of land. This occurs by way of approval known as a consent. Again, this is not automatic. It requires approval by the local authority. So again, the variations can happen within this consent and severance, we'll call it, condition. So again, just some closing reflections on talking about the off reserve, we'll say, conditions. So when we take a look at that, what we're really talking about is land use is all about planning and specific measures for bettering a community development. It provides a clear plan for organized community development. The next point says functions to establish minimum standards for land and development. And the next point is effective to minimize undesirable conditions. It's often based on standards set by the community officials. So again, we'll call it the authorities having jurisdiction. May include use of professional community planners, and maps and schedules provide the information for development purpose in the public at large. I had indicated earlier some slides that indicated, for example, what I had to go through for my particular house. And some of the zoning and some of the issues, and in some of we can see the areas that were set aside for different types of, we'll call it business or different types of function. So again, the fundamental goal underlying zoning and land development is to define and separate specific types of land use from each other, certainly for health, safety, and the well-being of people within any community. John?
Yep.
I'll pass the baton over to you then for a few minutes, right?
All right. So, one of the questions, since we've been talking about zoning, it's a European concept that we're trying to, advocate in the First Nations community. Is not meeting, a lot of the cultural, a lot of the governance understanding. And as part of my archive research, one thing about COVID gave me lots of extra time to read archival data or information on the Canadian archives, and I came across a few of these pictures of settlements and how they were being laid out. So here is a Canoe Lake First Nation circa 1880. And I called it petitions because, zoning wouldn't be a word. But it's interesting. You can see the layout of like, why are these laid out in certain areas? So you can sort of see here, there's one cluster here. It looks like a fire. There's another cluster of the fire here. And they all seem to be in some direction where the doors. So you can sort of see, an early layout. Here is another example of a Huron village. I think it was actually out of up near Midland where this was taken. Again, these were fortified, and so these were inside a fort. And again, you can sort of see the various layouts of the grounds. Here is another example of Sisika in circa 1880. And again, you can sort of see see if I can open this up a bit here. Well, that distorts it. Okay, I'll go back to where it was. So you can sort of see a bit of the layout. Again, in rules here, they're not all haphazardly, I'm going to put my tent here, or my teepee there, I'm going to reside here. So there's some method of form of how these tents were all arranged. And here is the Blackfoot Tipsy in Sisika, and again, circa 1880. And again, what I love about this picture is, they're all laid out in a specific in a row, and I assume, southern exposure for the doors. So again, just giving some of the type of layout historically in a lot of the communities. So was it zoning? No, but it was petitioning, and petitioning was early development for thinking of zoning. So again, why were these TPs or units laid out in certain manners within the field? So I just thought I'd point some of those pictures I found in the archives. So subdivision planning and zoning on reserve. Well, in this case, there are rules under the Indian Act. Section 81 sets out where the where the band council is the authority having jurisdiction. Again, I'll keep on raising this concept because we want to advocate the importance of communities and chief and councils exercising their responsibilities. So Section 1 here gives the band council the authority to develop land matters. So that includes zoning, environment protection, and construction and maintenance of water courses, roads, bridges, ditches, fence, and other local works. These bylaws apply only on their specific community. And we'll talk more about that later in the communities in the webinar. But what I want to point out was much the same way as municipal law, the Indian Act gives the First Nations the same authorities, believe it or not. And when we looked at approximately 650 communities, we were hard pressed to find that probably maybe 12 communities had actually up to date band bylaws that specifically stated, this is how we're zoning, or this are building codes that we're using. So suffice to say, as we reiterated in our authority having jurisdiction, again on zoning, very few communities have actually activated their zoning law requirements. One of the other piece of legislation that impacts First Nation communities is the First Nation Land Management Act. Gives the First Nations management reserve to reserve the lands under the act. It was adopted in 1999, and it basically gives First Nations the opportunity to manage their own property outside of the Indian Act. And there are approximately 100 communities or so that have actually exercised in First Nation land management their rights under the First Nation Land Management Act. So these powers under the FNLMA include management of how the land is being used, include zoning, subdivisions, environmental assessments, and protection. Each FNLMA First Nations, they first of all must adopt a land code approved by the community before they can act any powers under the First Nation Land Management Act. The land code will include general rules and procedures of how they're planning to use that. So, for example, these communities, Henry Inlet First Nations, have moved in that direction. There's also some really great information. The First Nations Land Management Resource Center, they have actually a really, I think, a fantastic manual on how to, on land governance. It includes, using GIS, land use planning, surveys, and related documents. This is an excellent source of information that is a go-to, and I highly suggest communities, people should look at that website and pull off that information. I'm just trying to see here. Another, how do I change this again? There we go. Another act, which is the First Nation Commercial and Industrial Development Act, allows the development of regulations beyond what's permitted under the Indian Act. So basically, it allows communities that have large, complex commercial, industrial areas, light industry, and it allows them to take control and to zone for those areas. So it basically is it's a stopgap or bandage to the Indian Act, and they introduced this piece of legislation. And it's designed to help to incorporate provincial legislation where there's there's gaps between federal rules, provincial rules, regulatory rules in terms of how to build commercial industries, basically that's similar to off reserve requirements, but are needed to on reserve. So again, there's been a few communities that have exercised the FNCIDA, and here's a few of them. Mainly Squamish is interesting because they're abutted up to an urban center, and they've done some major construction development, condos, and a lot of the communities that are using FNCIDA bridge against an urban center, so they want to take advantage of that episode. There's Ingold Pot corporations as well. They can have formal agreements. So with Musqueam First Nations, they develop for potash development. And in the Chinle First Nation solar project, they actually moved to electric power generation. And so they're using this to allow that framework to take place. Another area in First Nations is joint land use planning. So joint between a municipal, First Nation land use planning. It's working together with those communities that are butted up against an urban center. And you want to try to manage, similar um, projects. So a lot of the First Nations, for example, they have joint land use planning for infrastructure and joint economic development. So, sharing water, sewage. Some actually, as part of land use planning, enter into agreements for municipal services such as, fire protection. So joint use planning is again akin to many of those communities that are right up against an urban center, and they have excellent working relationship with the municipalities, and so they're able to develop all these land joint and planning and agreements. The other big discussion generally around land use is the duty to consult in land use planning. There's a requirement by the Crown to consult, including municipalities that have to consult in terms of land use. The duty to consult obliges the Crown and indigenous people to engage in a dialogue. It encourages them to reach some mutual agreeable solutions to their issues, which in further turn to the reconciliation process. Engage with First Nations communities and coordinate on land use planning matters. So there's some excellent examples of some land use plans. Let me back up here. So I don't want to spend a lot of time. There's a lot of discussions on duty to consult. There are a lot of manuals. There's a lot of resources. If you need it, resources, send Claude or me an email and I can fire them off to you. But this is, there's some excellent information here on what's required, duty consult, how to approach the members in terms of land use planning. So again, this is a whole webinar by itself. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but it's important that I raise it because it does impact planning involving First Nation lands. So land use plans. There are communities that have been developing land use plans, and there's these are 4 excellent examples. So basically taking, community consultations and figuring out, how are we going to use the land in terms of, as what Claude talked about, what's going to be commercial, what's going to be residential, what's going to be, agricultural areas. And these are just some examples of land use plans. I believe at one time, and it could still be the case, that the federal government had money available for land use planning. And I don't know if that's still the case today. I heard there may be down the road because, this is the cart before the horse, right? You can't go building, infrastructure and houses and townhouses if you don't have a proper land use plan. So we've been sort of advocating this area that needs to be expenditures need to be put in this area so that everything else can flow. So I want to go back to Section 81, 1G, the bylaws. So under the Indian Act, it specifically states that First Nations have the authority, having jurisdiction, where they can divide the reserve or portions of their community into zones and prohibit the construction and maintenance of any class of building or carry out any class of building trade within those zones. So what does an actual bylaw look like? Well, so the role of the zoning bylaws control the following areas. You can have land use, location and boundaries of commercial, residential, industrial, institutional, and conservation areas. You can locate, if you're up against a body of water, cottage sites. You can protect the forest or the natural resources. Just the other day, I was reading where in BC, a commercial property in BC a forestry a company harvested wood off of a First Nation that was protected. The board, and I think it was in BC, issued a $12,000 fine. And I believe the First Nation government turned around and issued a $120,000 fine for damage to the forestries. There we go. It's also, you can require campsites, including setting fees. You can require building permits for building specific zones, and it also includes a community plan. So zoning bylaws are important as they control the use of lands and establish standards according to which land can be developed. All lands within First Nation communities can be placed into a specific zone that is presented in the zoning map, and we'll show that a little later. Zoning is particularly important before homes are constructed. So the band council must first divide into these zones, and then based on those zones, you should be able to issue building permits. So again, we're talking about building permits, but again, very few communities issue building permits. So again, it's a catch-22, right? So the zoning laws say you need to have a building permit so you can build residential here. You need to have building permit for commercial building here. You need to have building permit because we're going to allow cottage to be built over there. So if you don't have control in terms of buildings, and you do that through building permit systems. So sample of zoning bylaws. I want to look at a couple of zoning bylaws. These bylaws include administration and zoning. And so I will go to the next. So here is Lac-Qui-Meul First Nations land use plan. And again, I'm going to try to open this up a bit. So we can see by looking at the property. Okay. So here we have agriculture, commercial recreation, commercial residential, commercial community use, environmental green space, industry, the village, Lac-Qui-Meul Village, residential, easements, transportation corridor, communities, other First Nations, municipal boundaries, and the river. So you can see, so here we have in just open this up a bit. So this has various small reserves under their land use planning. So each one of these are subdivided. So there's 8, 9, 10. So here at 9 would be here. And so you can see where they have, so this is all an agriculture area. And red is commercial, so it's right along the river here. So it just gives you some idea. And this was developed by a private company who was hired by the communities to exercise their land use planning. So give you an example here. So here we have, even further detail of another example where it's broken down: diesel plant, the trailer park, commercial, police and storage. So you can sort of see how they develop their land use planning. In December in 2023, the community of Natchitoches Innu First Nation, this is their community layout. Again, just gives you an idea of their planning. So that is it for our presentation. I know Claude had to slip out. And again, we were want to talk about zoning and subdivisions. I know on December 5th, we have a presentation on infrastructure and housing, which will again talk about zoning and the importance of authority having jurisdiction and what that how that impacts. I'm going to stop sharing screen so I can see if there's any chat here. Chat. Okay, so, all right, I'm just reading through some of the chat here. So Lisa mentioned they have 2 3-story apartments that are privately owned in their community. She also mentioned they have passive solar. Yeah, Lee mentioned about Doug Ford. Yeah, so the Ontario government has just recently changing all the planning. They're trying to densify the downtown core. So, for example, where I live in the older part of the city, on a 50 by 100-foot lot piece of property, they can now allow a 3-story condominium to go in my neighborhood, which is mind-boggling, but they now allow that to happen. So yes, there's a big change taking place. Zika mentioned in their community, yeah, they have a self-government treaty, a land use plan, and as well as many regulations. So Tewasawan, I believe is probably one of the more aggressive communities on taking the lead on land use planning, on self-government through their self-government planning. They have some excellent examples, and if you need any further information, reach out to Rasika because they've done some fantastic stuff there in the community and continue to expand, which is great. So is there any comments before we call it a webinar? Yeah, thanks for that, Rasika. Yeah, many of your documents are on the website. Yes, as a matter of fact, your bylaws for building permits, I think are really well done. So if anybody's looking at a good example of a bylaws for building permits and implementation and planning, look at what their community has done. So yeah, she gave the link. So okay. Go ahead, Rasika. Oh, unmute. There you go. I'm trying to unmute Rasika here. There you go.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just wanted to say that we're happy to connect with anybody, but basically, because Tawasan First Nation has gone through negotiations and signing a treaty, which almost is 13 years now, 2009, April 2009. They had to strategically think about many aspects of land management. So, including the land use plan, the Land Act. So within BC, the other jurisdictions, municipalities are bound by the Local Government Act, except City of Vancouver, which has its own charter. However, being a treaty nation who sits on the board, Metro Vancouver board, and is the only First Nation who's a member of the Metro Vancouver board, along with 21 municipalities. We are not bound by the Local Government Act. So TFN actually has their Land Act and also has the Land Use Planning Development Act, which has all kinds of regulations, policies that help. And the unique thing about TFN is we do have, like, physically we have a kind of an area that has long-term leases for residential development, commercial as well as industrial. And then we have an area called TFN community area, which is mainly for members only, and also non-market housing, which is affordable housing rentals. and some facilities like the youth center, the elder center, and a few other facilities that are being planned and will be built in the next 3 to 5 years. So there is a very elaborate process in place. We do comply with the BCBC code, which is basically the code is mainly for safety and other things that are needed. The zoning bylaw and all the other more than 20 to 24 regulations, plus a few policies, all are in place to make sure that we have orderly, safe development, also some sort of a complete community concept. We right now started working on the sustainability charter project because, keeping in mind the climate, global warming, and so many things that everybody's experiencing, and PFN is within the flood area. So we want to make sure a lot of development as well as other operational decisions are based on a sustainability charter, which will be a guiding document. So we started work on that. And to top it all, we do have a 5-year strategic plan. So our current strategic plan ends next year. So background work for the next 5-year strategic plan has begun as well. And I think if you have a 5-year strategic plan, it goes a long way in identifying what are the priorities that are important in certain communities, and how should budgeting or work plan be decided based on those priorities. And with a growing community, a lot of these priorities can keep changing, within a 5-year span. So I think those things are important as well. I just wanted to add that, I've shared the link, as well as there's a lot of information on our website. You can explore it yourself and reach out if there is any questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Rasika, did you, I know you follow the BC building code, and as we discussed in many of the webinars, that's basically a minimum standard. Has the community gone past the minimum standard for certain buildings and requirements? Do you know?
Yes, so that is a very interesting question, simply because we recently had an energy efficiency in buildings type of a webinar that was organized and funded by the Fraser Basin Council. And
Okay.
I think they've been working on a program called Train the Trainer, if you've heard of it.
Yeah.
So basically, this is capacity building within Indigenous communities across BC, and people with building and renovations and upgrades within Indigenous communities are being trained, because that's what's relevant versus, having like a stereotype training program, right? So we met 2 gentlemen who were also from Indigenous background who did the training, and it was just attended by some staff members, land staff members. But this conversation came there, and it was very relevant because the code just is very minimal standard, right? And now there is all this consideration for the code itself to apply step 3 or step 4 and whatnot. So it's being geared, like some of the jurisdictions have already adopted, starting January of 2023, there's a mandatory requirement to achieve step 3 or step 4. So specific to PEN, we have applied some of these, especially to the facilities that, like the new elder center. There's a new elder center being built, which will be completed in the next, construction has begun, and it's progressing well. It'll be completed in 1.5 to 2 years max. And it's a very complicated building, but, our elders have been waiting for many, many years. And I think it has a fairly good sustainability lens in that sense. So it's not, it's probably, I think it's designed to step 3 or 4. So I think we are trying. We have, we have the realization that a lot of our assets, so whether it's rental housing assets or other facilities, in the long run are going to cost us more in operating, right? And it's all about that. So mainly, if you want to contribute towards managing your own assets sustainably, then just the code, meeting the code is not adequate. So we are putting in efforts. I think some of our newer housing, the affordable housing projects will be looking at step 3 or 4, which will achieve more than 40% energy efficiency. Yeah, we are looking at that definitely, and we're trying to incorporate that. It's bit of a challenging conversation with individual homeowners because there is a higher cost involved upfront, and they need to qualify, through a mortgage. There's a lot of support from TFN government, like we have a pre-development grant and we have some servicing grant, and all these programs are basically to bring back some of our members who are living off lands. And I think there's support that there are some service lots that are being offered too, and this is only for the primary residents, so it's not for people who want it as an investment, so people who actually need it as their residents to live in it. So there's enough, like there's a lot of, like the operation is all based on no member left behind type of a principle, but can it be sustainable in the long run, right? So ultimately, TFN government has to spend a lot on maintenance, repairs, operational costs that will go up as the assets start getting older. And I think having to, thinking about this proactively and, incorporating anything that's beyond just the basic code is what we are trying to achieve. Slowly and steadily, we are going there. We started with our own facilities, and slowly, I think it's a matter of educating our members as well as we go ahead.
Right. Excellent comments. Yeah, because we've been trying to, I know on some of the projects on the north that we're trying to encourage communities, especially on the energy efficiency equations, to go past the minimum. And the challenge we have, well, what does that mean and what cost? Because there is an increased cost, but there are numbers that show by paying more now, you save down the road. But it's hard to reconcile that with people who are getting mortgages, right? So it's a catch-22, but I think it's a question of education, which is the key on a lot of this stuff. So.
Yeah,
All right.
absolutely. And I know that some of the municipalities have put in some incentives for people to, like they have, like lower taxes for the first 3 years, or, some other incentives, density bonusing, whatnot, which is applicable in most of the municipalities. But with the indigenous communities, I think it's more of an understanding and probably a partnership between the government and the individual, so that there is some sort of cost sharing and, like creative models like rent to own, or we are also trying out TFN government is going to be building 6 duplexes, which is 12 units, and they are basically going to be built by government, but to be bought. So it's like a different model that we're trying, and that project is going to be interesting. The members who would like to buy that need to qualify for a certain amount, which is the cost to build those units, but it's a different model. So, there are some creative ways of doing things, but again, education and awareness creation is a long-term goal, and I think that every community should try and pursue that.
Right. Yep. Again, good comments, great insight. So, all right. Anybody else have any further comments or questions? If not, we will. So we don't need for this Thursday. We thought we had 3. But we're sending out some links for some additional webinars. And again, I encourage everyone to download the authority having jurisdiction document that we just put on and go through that. And if there's any questions, reach out to FNNBOA and we're providing further insights. So, all right. Thank you, everyone.